Hello and welcome to ATARC's webinar series. Today, topic experts will cover how priorities and strategies have evolved in the months since the Biden Cybersecurity Executive Order. My name is Kirsten Patton, the Working Group Program Manager here at ATARC, and I have the pleasure of moderating today's panel. I would like to welcome all of our attendees and a special thanks to Stacy Giancura and the Red Hat team. This afternoon, we are going to hear from our panelists, which will be followed by Q&A, where we will pop in a few polls and then answer your questions. So before we begin, I just want to encourage you, the audience, to please submit questions of your own in the Q&A section of this platform, and we will be going through them during this panel discussion. So please send them in as we go, and also remember to answer any of the poll questions that come up throughout today in order to ensure that you receive your CPE credits. And with that, I would like to ask our panelists to please come on camera. Hello, everybody. I'm going to have each of you go ahead and introduce yourselves. Let's start off with Davon, please. Oh, you're muted.
It's great. I turn the camera on, but don't turn the mic on. Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Davon Tyler. I'm the Chief Information Security Officer of the U.S. Met. I spent most of my career in the Department of Defense, but have been excited to be in the Treasury and to be invited to join this panel.
Excellent. Nice to have you here. And then let's hear from Trefinia next.
Hey, good afternoon. My name is Trefinia Salzman. I'm one of the security architects for the Small Business Administration. I've been here for about 1.5 years now. Prior to that, I worked in the financial sector. So excited to talk about Zero Trust.
Thank you. And then over to you, Allison. Allison, you're muted as well.
Okay, hi, I'm Allison McCall. I'm the CIO at NTIS, which is under the Department of Commerce. Glad to be with you today.
Excellent, thank you. And then over to Michael.
Yeah, thank you. Mike Eckley. I'm a Chief Architect and Security Strategist for the Red Hat North American Public Sector. And I've been working in the DoD and intelligence community with a lot of our customers building and securing their system. And lately I've been involved in the Zero Trust Special Interest Group here at Red Hat and formulating our strategy around Zero Trust and helping our customers understand what it is and how to navigate and implement Zero Trust.
Excellent. Well, thank you for those introductions. So today we're going to be discussing navigating the road ahead with Zero Trust, but let's first take a step back and talk about how, Zero Trust is a new term for a lot of people. So maybe we could start off by explaining what Zero Trust even is in your words. And then if another panelist has something they'd like to contribute, we can go from there. But let's start off with Davon, please.
So Zero Trust to me is a couple of things, and I think the executive order did a justice kind of outlining is implementing best practices. So taking things that we all know to be doing, should be doing, such as identifying our assets and hardening those assets. The other two pieces is isolating those assets from the network and then authenticating those assets before giving the authentication or the authorization to access that resource. So it's those three things, the patching, best practices, identification, and then isolation.
Thank you. And then, is that along the lines of how you're defining Zero Trust at SBA and within the working group at ATARC?
Yeah, to just put it succinctly, it's a strategy. It's a shift in strategy. It's a shift in culture. It's a shift in the way that you architect your infrastructure. It's not a product. It's not a service, but it is a accumulation of all of those things.
Excellent. And then Allison or Michael, is there anything else you would like to add to this definition of Zero Trust?
I think they've done a great job. Again, it is an architecture, a model, a framework, not just one product, an overall all-encompassing look.
Great.
Yeah, and I'll build on that and also emphasize, yeah, it is a holistic view of approaching security for our systems, and it is layered on top of and builds on a lot of the existing
Fantastic. All right. Well,
foundations we've had for a long time in our system. And emphasizing.
well, fantastic. Thank you guys for clearing that up. An analogy that's often used, and this is actually how it was explained to me as well, is that it's often described as a castle and a wall. And we need more rings of these walls. So, or in other words, moving away from a perimeter defense. How good do you feel that this mental model of a castle and a wall surrounding it is for zero trust? Or is there another example of a way in which you could describe it to somebody who is new to this concept and wants to be able to kind of better see it in their head? And that could go for any of the panelists. Feel free to jump in.
Yeah. I'll go ahead and jump in there. I find that analogy useful, and we see it a lot when we talk about zero trust because it's pretty easy to understand in that mental model, but it's also a little bit incomplete in the sense of that implies that there's a single boundary, a security boundary, that wall. And in reality, zero trust aims to build many security boundaries throughout your enterprise and the layered defense. And it also requires more than that. So in the castle analogy, you might be inside that castle wall, therefore privileged because of that. But zero trust asks us, instead of just assuming that you're trustworthy because you're inside the castle and you've gone through that gate, instead, every time you interact with somebody inside that castle, a villager, the blacksmith, that you get re-authenticated and your identity is reestablished, reasserted, and that you're asked, if you actually need to talk to the blacksmith or you need to do something inside that wall. And I actually prefer to use other analogies that are maybe a little closer to home. So I've previously used the bar analogy where you've got maybe a bouncer at the door of the bar, but the bartender isn't going to just trust that. You might have had a side deal with the bouncer, and instead he's going to ask for that ID and recheck your credentials beforehand. And if he sees, and he's probably good at seeing a lot of fake IDs, he might toss your credentials, or he might deny you access to the drinks behind the bar if he doesn't believe you. And I think that layer defense, is more emblematic, and the credential process more emblematic of what we actually aim for in a zero trust environment.
Ah, that's great. I like that analogy. Anyone else want to weigh in on that?
This is Davon. I'll kind of add in. I used to run perimeter defense for DESA, and we built the walls. We had huge walls. And one of the things that we noticed, especially with COVID, that a lot of people are not going through these walls anymore. Most of the services that access are actually external to us, and this great security that we built is not being used. So I think zero trust allows us to move that security, that wall, from the perimeter down to the machine. And then I think Michael had a great analogy. Then it started to be more critical on what gets access and how it gets access.
All right, fantastic. Thank you all. So then I want to ask what organizational changes need to be made in order to foster zero trust. What internal messaging are you and your team driving around zero trust with both IT organizations and mission customers? So Trefinia, maybe you can speak to that first.
Yeah, well, it's been challenging, to be completely honest. It's challenging because you're also changing the way people have done things. We're bettering security and bettering the infrastructure, but it's also been interesting to figure out who the leads are for specific applications. The SBA has been around for a little while, and so we have a lot of legacy applications. So it's been challenging to find the right team leads and bring them into the conversation. But how we're doing this practically is by holding actually like our own working group, and we meet every day and we go through the strategy and the architecture. We kind of have 30 minutes and just chat about what we're doing, and then we bring in people as we need them to discuss the different pillars. So for identity, we may get someone else in, whereas data, we may pull someone from operations or a business owner. So that's just how we've been tackling it at the SBA.
Yeah, thank you. And then Allison, how about over at NCIS? What organizational changes have you been making in order to foster zero trust?
Well, one thing I've been doing is to send out the guidance that we're receiving, and it is in stages. First, we had the executive order, then we had, and also this guidance, and now we have a maturity model in draft. And I think starting with the executive order, which is very, very high level and doesn't really explain zero trust, but what lays the background has been a good thing to do. And we're making sure that not just our employees, but our joint venture partners in industry that work with NTIS receive this information so that they can further help we work with other federal agencies, and that enables them to really start understanding what this means and what the implications are.
Excellent, thank you. Michael, did you want to add anything? I saw you were off mute.
Yeah, I agree with a lot of the comments already that it is going to take some cultural changes and re-looking at, some of the assumptions that we've built into our system today that weren't designed around these concepts. And I talk with a lot of our customers about how to do that. And one of the things that's going to be a big challenge is when we build systems today, we are used to having these systems built in isolation. For example, sysadmins having ownership and control over those systems, who gets access. And that's the kind of thing that in the cultural change that we're going to have to adapt to, and integrating in with things like enterprise inventory management systems, so we know where our accesses are and our privileges are, and the logging and observability mechanisms so we can validate that and keep track of movement of those privileges in our system. And those kind of things are not currently even practiced by a lot of our application owners or our system owners. And the other thing I think is going to be critical, and I see this in the guidance as it's developing, is this idea of what a resource is. And I think Davon kind of alluded to this earlier, but the idea that everything inside your enterprise, an individual resource, has its own access controls and own rules, is going to be a foreign concept. It's no longer just isolated systems. Every part of that system is potentially its own separate resource managed differently. The data, the application, maybe the network or the storage, all different aspects of that, all potentially different. And that's not something that we're used to breaking apart like that.
Thank you. We have an audience question come in about guidance. So there are a number of recently published zero trust architecture recommendations, as we know from NIST, NSA, DISA, MITRE, et cetera. Which recommended zero trust architecture should the industry focus on to most effectively help the federal government at large? Insights from our panelists?
Yeah. Practically the most recent one that just came out this week, I was reading over it. It has the federal trust strategy from OMB. I really like that one because it gave some real specifics, such as setting up phishing resistant MFA. That's something that the industry can help us with, and it clearly articulates the requirement. So I would suggest the industry to look at that, and that would greatly help the government because we'll be figuring out how to meet that floor, that security baseline with that strategy.
Excellent. Thank you, Triffania.
Yeah.
All right. So Devon, outside of just the organizational changes that will be needed to made in order to foster zero trust, which I still would love to hear from you on that as well, but could you also share what your assessments are pointing at the top 3 priorities for zero trust architecture adoption at your agency?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. I think number one is just getting everyone on the same page. I think you started off with the question, what is zero trust? And it's something that I spent a lot of time here at the Mint, getting everyone to understand, not just the cybersecurity people, but the system administrators, the telecommunication people, everyone, and then of course the users on what zero trust is. So that's number one is getting that common understanding of what it is. Number two is developing that strategy. I think Trifinia definitely mentioned that, developing that strategy that's holistic, that includes a timeline on what do you do and how do you get there. And I think number three has to just be, the implementation piece and making sure that you start small. I've talked to a couple industry experts, and you do not, and we use that term ZTA architecture, but you do not want to throw everything in. It's not like the cloud. You want to start very small, build out that capability, proof it out, and then learn from it. So I think those are the three. And I think from your earlier question, the cultural piece, it's tough. You have to get people kind of understanding that, hey, there's a shift in methodology, but then it also wrap them around that, hey, look, we're going to try to do SSO, we're going to try to make life easier, but for other times it may be more challenging, and I think that's going to be a harder sell.
Thank you for sharing that. Allison, do your top three assessment points match what Davon just shared with us, or are you guys working on some other things at NTIS?
Well, I think he came up with a good three. I think in zero trust and in looking at the maturity level, you need to be very careful and implement slowly, keep your current tools in place, add on layers. There could even be some privacy issues with, some of the areas, especially, identity, and when you're really at a level where you're trying to optimize, you have to be careful that you don't break or cause an issue in another area.
Right. Yeah, excellent. Thank you for that. And then Michael, from the industry perspective, do you have any insights as to what people within their agency should be prioritizing?
Yeah, I mean, I think all the points already made are great. We, a moment ago, talked about things like MFA. A lot of these things like MFA are going to be low-hanging fruit, easy to do, and will help move the goalpost along towards getting to zero trust. But those easy things are going to be easy to tackle right away. The other thing that we're going to start to have to look at, though, is the existing process and business processes behind zero trust that agencies are going to have to adopt to. And this is, again, going to go back to the cultural adaptation necessary. But to date, things like a need to know for your access is not a concept common across most of our agencies and industries. And yet part of how you establish access and verify access in a zero trust architecture. And we're going to have to develop processes for establishing that need, proving it, revalidating that, and then revoking access when that need is no longer necessary. And those needs are going to have to be driven by business processes and business need, things that aren't well captured today. And in general, we don't have the governance necessary to do that whole lifecycle management. The other thing that we can start with is our security basics, just making sure that we have those existing hardened boundaries. And zero trust, as I kind of alluded to in my introduction, starts with the assumption of the ability to create those strong security boundaries. That it's built around this concept of a default deny all, right? We're going to allow access where warranted, but we're going to deny otherwise. So if we can't even do that deny all to start with those, by practicing security hardening and the basics, patching, and making sure our systems are configured correctly, we're going to have our time doing the more complex things that zero trust is going to require. And automation and system automation, enterprise automation tools are going to be part of that, as well as building systems from trustworthy components. And this is why zero trust is capturing that DO around other topics, things like MFA and supply chain risk management and other things of that nature, because it's all going to build towards that zero trust architecture.
Excellent. Thank you for those insights. Let's go ahead and throw up our first poll question, since we've discussed zero trust and what it all is. This is the first one today. Zero trust based security is, and then you can answer software product, security service, an architecture, or a concept that allows trusted and untrusted access in a similar way. So if you're at home, please answer this and you'll receive your CPE credit for attending today's session. So, okay, moving on to another round of questions that we have for our panelists. Davon, let's start with you again. What is different about Zero Trust from how we historically have secured systems? What are some of the differences you've seen?
I'll go back to that perimeter. We put this moat around of us, and we really haven't done a great job with the internals. Once you're in, I think Michael, he talked about it. Once you're in, and you have access to everything with Zero Trust. We now go by that default deny, and we start to validate. Take me, for example, just because I'm inside of my Mint building, do I need to have access to every printer? And with Zero Trust, it would tell you no, right? I should only have access to the resources I need access to. And I think that really kind of challenges us to identify who needs what and then keep track of it. And that's probably really going to be the hard piece, keeping track of who needs what and when do they need access.
Thank you. Do any of our other panelists want to weigh in on the differences from how we previously secured systems?
Yeah, I'm happy
Michael's
to
off
jump in.
mute. Does that mean?
Yeah, I've
Okay,
been
go for
keeping
it.
myself off mute, but I'm happy to jump in and build on what Devon said, about our boundaries, thinking about what they are, because we have a lot of security boundaries in our systems today. The issue is a lot of those boundaries aren't designed to enforce zero trust principles, right? They are security boundaries designed to protect our systems defensively, but not necessarily allow access using contextual and identity-aware mechanisms or using a need-to-know concept. And that's where we're going to have to add that. So we need to look at our existing security boundaries, which we might have, and see which ones we can reuse for that purpose, build on that, or whether we need to add new boundaries to that. But that's kind of the fundamental difference between how we built security systems before, is those security boundaries weren't designed around that denial and allow when needed concept. And in fact, a lot of these security boundaries are designed to protect the IT systems, but not control access. And we have separate access control systems for that. And Zero Trust, again, wants us to look at that more holistically and tie those boundaries together.
Thank you. And I knew you were off mute, but that was my safety to fall back on. Now I can't call you out. All right, so we had an audience question that came through. Allison, do you want to take this one? Someone is asking, how are you paying for your Zero Trust journey? Have you had to apply for TMF funding? If so, any outcomes or any insights into the financials of it all?
Well, I think it's going to be difficult, and it's dependent on the agency. And for us, we expect agency-wide effort, and is going to have funding available for all the components in commerce. It may be limited, it may not happen. I don't think it's arrived yet, but that is our hope. And it's dependent on the agency and the structure of the organization. But if you can do it as a department-wide effort, I think sharing the costs, maybe making some cost savings when purchasing products, I think that might be a good way to go about it.
Great, thank you. Trifini, what about over at SBA? How are you funding the Zero Trust journey?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. The federal strategy does talk about the budget. It says that we need to implement or have a implementation plan by fiscal year 2022 to 2024. And then it also asks that we submit our budget estimate for fiscal year 2023 and 2024. Also, how we did it at the SBA is we used the TMF. We submitted specifically for our network pillar, specifically for the modernization and of our network, and making sure that that will be a good foundation for Zero Trust principles. And that's how that's what we did. We submitted specifically for our network. We're still waiting to hear back. I'm curious if anyone has heard back yet on that modernization funding. We have not just yet. We're still waiting.
Yeah, excellent. And Davon, what about over at US Mint?
Yeah, the United States Mint is a little bit unique since literally we make money and it's not an appropriated agency. So we actually, it's very unique. But we're finding that zero trust is as expensive as as it may seem, and that there's a lot of technology that we already have today that supports a lot of the zero trust premises. So looking at that, seeing what we can adapt, and then putting in our regular cybersecurity budgets, those enhancements. So instead of trying to do it all at once, we're trying to break it down. So from my, from a CISO to my CIO perspective, he doesn't have this huge bill. He has a bunch of small bills that over time we build into, ZTA architecture.
Yeah, to that's why we went with the network portion, the network pillar to ask for funding. And then like identity and data, we have the tools. We just need to tweak it so that it can be zero trust or has that design principles. I agree with the bill.
Yeah, and I'll emphasize from our perspective, we see modernization, cybersecurity, zero trust inherently linked to each other. So as agencies are modernizing other legacy IT systems, doing their digital transformation journeys or cloud adoption, those things are inextricably tied to zero trust, and it's very easy to align those if you like. In fact, one of the important things about the maturity model that CISA released is it lays a pathway for doing that. And agencies can identify where they're weak and where they can apply existing modernization efforts to move their zero trust adoption forward on those pillars. And among those, I mentioned enterprise automation earlier as being one of the critical aspects, because many of these maturity steps are simply taking existing manual processes for things like inventory or asset management or business process governance and just automating those. And these are all just, modernization activities already covered by the TMF potentially, and where the TMF wasn't previously clear, guidance has been established that means zero trust is covered under that and under the cybersecurity auspices of that. And then there's other resources throughout the federal government, being whole government response to CISA, NFA, and other agencies providing guidance and tools. For example, BNS and Security NS is now something that is being promoted heavily within the government and part of our zero trust strategy.
Great questions and great answers. So let's pop up our second poll question while we're here. And the question is, where do you currently stand in zero trust architecture implementation? Your options include what's zero trust, hopefully you know that now, researching and starting to wrap my head around how a ZTA will benefit my agency organization, researching IT cybersecurity tools and strategies to start building, starting to implement zero trust at my agency, or we have our ZTA defined and rolled out. So please take a moment and answer that one. So next question for our panelists, we have another audience question. We'll answer that first. Currently, multiple identities such as privilege versus user is a best practice. This person is wondering, with zero trust, will this still remain true? Thoughts from the panel?
So my thought is, I think to some extent it will. With zero trust, right, you have your identity, the NIST, I think it's NIST, but their documentation has the different databases. It has like a subject database and identity, and then it has a threat intelligence, and it's all going into that trust algorithm in the middle. So I think when you have that trust algorithm set up correctly, and you have that identity checking in constantly, depending on what that identity is accessing. I think I'm just talking this through. I think it's not going to be so defined as far as user and privilege, but it's just going to be based on a second by second. And if that user can access that specific data or access that specific endpoint or access when and where, all of that is going to correlate into that trust algorithm. And so then that person, depending on what access they have and the policies that you have defined within that trust algorithm, is going to dictate whether you are a user or a privileged user. I hope that makes sense.
Yeah, no, that was a great answer. Do any of the other panelists want to chime in?
Yeah, I'll go agree completely with
Okay.
comments there. Yeah, there's going to be a gradation. We're no longer talking on complete unprivileged versus privileged. Zero trust access to look at the overall totality of the context for any particular access and allow the content, access that's warranted given the business risk and the other policies that you might have in place for determining the balance between the need, the business requirement, and the need and the risk associated to the system. And so there's no longer this concept of like a completely unprivileged or privileged. It's a gradation and a scale that will, whether we use advanced AI ML algorithms to determine where you lie on that scale, or whether it's some rule-based or other system that does that, you might potentially land anywhere on that. But the IT world has been moving in that direction for a long time, where we've seen, this gradation and this separation of roles into finer and finer steps, where we can add or remove privileges based on exactly what you need at a given time. And Zero Trust is mostly just asking us to take that seriously, to actually only provide a least privileged model. And importantly, when that need isn't present anymore, to remove all access, right? To move to a zero privilege or a zero standing privilege model, where if you're a sysadmin, you don't even need to access the system unless you're actually doing something on that system. So we should delete that account, remove that privileged access account from the system when it's not in use and unnecessary.
Okay. Davon, were you going to say something?
Yeah, I would just say, from a practicality standpoint, I think in the short term, we're going to see the IT, the current ways of doing things probably still there, but long term, I definitely agree with Trefinia and Michael that long term, that's the objective, to get to that single entity and control that access. But for the short term, until technology and everything else catches up, we're going to see some old practices. And I think you said in the executive order, if you read it today, there's a lot of best practices that are already baked in that we're going to continue to do. And then over time, we're going to get to where Michael and I think we all want to get to where that access is controlled by what you need and when you need it, and then it's pulled back.
Great. And then someone else followed up, I think it's with that same question. Will the user and privileged user have the same unique identifier and attributes be the only distinguisher? So if you guys want to follow up on that one.
I don't think so. I think it's going to take into consideration everything. So like all of the data, all of the metadata around the user and privileged user. I'm thinking about maybe a use case being like a service account that may need to stay as a privileged user or user depending on what it is accessing. So I think Davon's right on the money. Like right now, it's going to take some time to get to that point of not having those defined roles of user and privileged user. Okay. I think it is changing.
Yeah. And Allison, I see you have your hand raised. Did you want to chime in?
Yes, I did want to chime in. This is where I think that everyone should take a look at the maturity model and make comments. They've asked they have an open comment period. And really refine this even more if we can. And those of you in industry, what we don't want to do is just attack it from the standpoint of your product, but make sure that everything is covered in a meaningful way and that there's a meaningful progression. And I think it's going to be a lot harder than it may seem. I think the model, the maturity model is very good, but I think it needs some more clarification and refining. And so this is a really good time for subject matter experts in different areas to weigh in and make some recommendations.
Thank you. Okay, so let's talk about the main challenges to moving our systems towards zero trust. What are the main challenges, roadblockers towards adoption at your agency that you've seen, or if you're with industry, how you would consult with other agencies? So let's start with Davon, please.
I'll say I was a little bit lucky. This has started on the road to zero trust a couple of years ago, and I had to be somewhat a part of it. I had a guy that was 2 doors down from me. So to answer the question earlier, I'm a little bit DISA biased. What guidance you should look at, definitely look at DISA. And that's just me being biased. It's good guidance. I know the guys that wrote it and spent a lot of time supporting it. And I would say back to the challenges, at least two in my mind is getting past the marketing piece. I know every company has a zero trust solution. So getting past that, just the marketing words and finding out what piece. And Trafini, I think she definitely spelled it out right with the pillars, understanding what pillar they actually fall into and how can you, and I think Allison had it too, how can you take that piece and then integrate it with your architecture? And sometimes it may be easy, sometimes it may be hard. Other piece, I think at the Mint, it's been a challenge, just the education piece, because you have the marketing spin that's been going around for a couple of years. And there's some people, they see that word architecture and they really think that it's this brand new thing that you have to build, this brand new castle with a new moat, and you build everything into it. And it's almost the opposite, where you take what you currently have and you start to engineer and integrate small pieces of zero trust. And over time, hopefully we get maybe 2024, we get to that zero trust where at the Mint, we have that holistic zero trust approach, but it's not something that's going to be brand new and separate.
Great answer. Trafini, challenges for you all SBA?
When it comes to zero trust and everything that we're doing, I would say it's probably getting everyone on the same page, kind of making sure that we're all, like, we had to define what zero trust meant to the SBA, and we did that last year, but we're having to go back and reiterate it, especially when there's been changes, like management changes, and making sure that everyone is on the same page. I would say that there's challenges with business and IT. Specifically, there's a technical piece and the person piece that we're having challenges with. The technical piece being that we have legacy applications and we may have something on-prem, and instead with the recent modernization funding and the recent executive order to call for modernization and making sure that we're moving to the cloud, some of those legacy applications, it's tougher to move those to the cloud. So that definitely offers some level of challenge.
Great. And then Allison, same question over to you. And has it been more the business side or the IT side that's been the challenge?
I think with zero trust, it's going to be the IT side. The business side, I think we've got some guidance in place already. It's moving along, but I think we've got, as I mentioned earlier, we really have some technical challenges with this, and it's very important. One example is using machine learning. That isn't an exact science. It takes time, it takes practice. We do a lot of that type of work at other federal agencies as a part of our joint venture partnership. So I know that, from what I've read, this is going to be a difficult challenge. So that's just one example of what one could face. So I think we're going to have a lot of technical challenges that need to be looked at. And I'm sure that I think we've started in the right direction. So I think the help is going to be there. And again, it should be from industry too, as well as subject matter experts in government.
Thank you. And then Michael, did you want to add anything before we move on?
Yeah, I think there's going to be challenges on both sides. And I think the other panelists hit on many of these on both the organizational and the technology side. Coming from industry, we probably take a closer look at the technology, and there we see potentially a huge amount of challenges that are going to intersect, right? So it's going to be, and I talked about things like business process automation and management, and one of the challenges of zero trust is that we're going to be asked to do many of these things on a continuous basis. So we're continuously revalidating our identities, revalidating our context, our need to know, our accesses. Many of our IT systems were never designed around, and I talked about zero standing privileges a moment ago. And applications in many cases, or IT systems were designed around like the idea of a central root account, for example, that like the backdoor break glass or allow your sysadmins that root level access so they can manage devices or manage applications. And we're gonna have to move away from that model, but a lot of IT systems never designed around. They were also never designed around the idea of we talked about fine-grained differences between user and privileged users, and that it's going to be a broader spectrum in the future. And again, they weren't designed around that kind of role-based access control. You either were or were not a sysadmin, for example. And so IT systems are going to have to modernize for that. The other big thing will be the fact that we have to provide all this contextual data from our activities throughout our enterprises. So wiring up our IT and other business systems so that we can collect that data and make appropriate access decisions to do so is going to be another big challenge. That's going to require extra resources on the IT side. We have to deploy those monitoring tools and create that monitoring infrastructure, as well as then close the loop and feed that back into our access decisions and governance tools. And all those things are going to involve that. That's just going to facilitate now the business, tackling those business challenges. One thing I will say though is that at least with zero trust, the Cyber and the zero trust strategy, the national strategy is giving us runway to do that. So we're talking several years of runway. We're not being asked to do this overnight, and zero trust concepts aren't new. So a lot of people in this panel have been thinking about these issues for years, and at least can help move that along now that we have the impetus under the Cyber to do so.
Absolutely. And speaking of the challenges, let's go ahead and pop up our third and final poll question from today, which will be from the following list: what would you consider to be most challenging at your agency? And I'll read through the options for those who are dialed in right now. These include network segmentation, protecting workloads, strict user authentication, protecting workstations and mobile devices, protecting IoT, OT devices, data encryption, classification and protection, threat visibility and analysis, and last but not least, security automation and orchestration. So please go ahead and answer that one. That's our last poll question. And then we can discuss our next poll question, or our next panel question. Wrapped up in this idea of zero trust is deprimaturization. Oh man, don't ask me how to spell that word. Okay. Are we ready, or will we ever be ready to give up on the idea of intranets, VPNs, and other traditional enterprise boundaries? So deprimaturization. Say that 3 times fast though, seriously. Davon, what are your thoughts there?
I breathe because it's tough, because I built the perimeter. So it's almost like getting rid of something that you built for years. I do think we'll get there. I do think with what Trifini is saying, in the world that Michael's talking about that we're going to live in, that there will be a time to where you no longer need to consider something external or internal. Everything is untrusted with the zero trust model, and you start to validate and vet that resource or access to that resource each and every time. And I think once we do that, we do it properly. There's no reason to have that perimeter, because it's just a waste of space.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you. Allison, any thoughts about that?
I think that that's going to be a difficult challenge, and some of it is. I spoke briefly about technical challenges. Some of it could be a business challenge, and some larger agencies, the way people are set up to be responsible for a network or a series of systems is going to make it more difficult to go to a different model. And so I anticipate, I don't think they're technical challenges, but I think perimeter defense, people have worked so hard to get to a certain point. They're not going to want to give it up easily. And maybe they shouldn't give it up until they have everything in place. I'm sort of suggesting taking the maturity model and adding in your status, what tools you have in each area, and their level of maturity, and kind of looking across the board and determining, are you ready to give something up at this point and move to something that should be better in theory.
Great, thank you guys. The next question that I have on this list, Triffany, I'll point it to you first. With the recent cybersecurity executive order coming from the Biden administration, prominently calling our zero trust architectures, are we going to see a lot of people offering solutions? What kind have you seen so far, if any?
Yeah, I definitely think so. Zero trust is a big, I think Michael even said it, it's a big marketing term. We get a lot of people come to us asking that, or telling us that they have the zero trust solution. And again, I want to reiterate that zero trust is just a set of design principles. It's not really a service or a technology that you can buy. I'll do a plug here for ATARC, one of the co-working chairs for the Zero Trust Working Group. And we are going to be having different industry leaders and different vendors come in and provide their solutions and tell us what pillar that they touch on. For example, if there's a specific vendor that only deals with identity, then they may partner with another vendor that deals with data, and they can provide the solution to government agencies. So that's been very helpful. Again, there's been a few things. I mean, I've read up on Google's Beyond Corp, and that's been pretty good. Also, the NSA has a zero trust document that's pretty, I like how it reads. It's not super technical, but it's a nice flow. And then again, with this federal zero trust strategy, I'm really looking forward to when that goes through the approval. I think that provides the clarity that agencies in the industry will need to implement zero trust.
Excellent, thank you. And then Michael, how about you from the industry side in terms of the Biden EO?
Yeah, I mean, I think the Biden EO, and I touched on this earlier, he tries to bundle in a lot of these different things around cybersecurity in an effort to push that forward. And, I've heard zero trust described as the future of cybersecurity because it does incorporate many of these concepts and depends on these. So that cuts both ways. It means that, we'll see a lot of people marketing their product and technologies because they can fit almost anything under the rubric of zero trust. But to some extent, that's true, right? Every little bit that you can add to improve the hardening of your systems and your ability to make access decisions helps move that ball forward. So there are a lot of different things you can do to improve your maturity around that zero trust maturity model. I mentioned, enterprise automation is one thing that's going to be, I think a critical step because, many of those maturity model items are, like I said, converting manual to automated processes. But there's also point solutions around the network or the data management or things of that nature, or encryption solutions to protect your data at rest that, individual vendors and solutions can certainly help you address. And then touching back on the deperimeterization, right? There's a lot of deperimeterization that, we don't necessarily want to destroy our VPN, but maybe we can reuse those same security boundaries that those create and convert those to something that can be used to enforce zero trust boundaries. And we see, marketing around SASE solutions, for example, that aim to do that, which, they could be properly described as zero trust. But yes, it's not a complete solution. Zero trust is that more wholesome architecture that we have to look at more completely. So it cuts both ways. And, I think Red Hat's been very careful to make sure we're not trying to, promote things as a zero trust solution. And we want to be careful to make sure that we do talk about it from that holistic architecture perspective.
Great, thank you. And then, Davon, what would you say to someone who's asking, is zero trust going to be too much for modern, agile, or DevSecOps approaches? Is it going to be so that ordinary people can just practice it, or what are some of your thoughts around that?
I think Trifini already hit it. I would tell them, look at what Google's doing. I mean, Google's done it for years now. When it comes to agile and deploying new applications and new software, leveraging zero trust, that white paper is really well written to describe their journey towards it. I would also tell them that it doesn't necessarily shift everything that you're doing today. Hopefully, it also makes things a little bit easier. There's times where we're over challenging it, and then now we get to a point where we can actually properly challenge the resource, access to that resource, so your life becomes a little bit easier and less cumbersome. As we kind of gone through the passwords to SSO to MFA, things should be getting a little bit better as we mature.
Awesome. Thank you so much for clearing that up. So with less than 10 minutes left, I want to give each of you the opportunity to share final thoughts. What do you want to leave the audience with that they can take away and bring back to their own organizations when it comes to navigating the road ahead with zero trust, or anything that you've taken away yourself from this conversation? And if we could go around, starting with Allison, please.
Hey, I've got a lot of good insight today from the panel, and that was great. I'll start thinking about some of the comments. Again, this is a planning effort, and look at the maturity model, submit comments, because the better that document is, the better for all of us. And also, I think maybe look at it as a framework to see that you have coverage, and also start trying to understand your status in the maturity model. So that's what I think is very important at this point.
Fantastic, thank you. And then I'll turn it over to Trifinia next.
Yeah, I would just leave with everyone this phishing resistant MFA. I found it to be super interesting, and it touches on universal second factor. I just found it to be fascinating, and I really would love to see the rest of the industry and government agencies implement that. I think having something like that will allow our security posture as a whole to be better.
Excellent. Thank you so much. Davon, I'll hear from you next, please.
Yeah, I want to echo one point from Allison, and then I'll have another point. I think what Allison, and she's saying it really well, is that we should all assess where we are in a maturity model, and then make sure that before we try to run, that we can properly crawl. If you go out there and I think you try to get rid of everything all at once, you're going to find yourself very exposed. So assessing where you are and then making the proper decision, I think, is a great point. The second piece is when you get into that journey is to start small. Make sure you look at an application, maybe not start with your most critical application, but start with an application and then build zero trust around an application, and then conduct lessons learned and really spend some time talking to other people, talking to your peers to make sure you understood what worked, when didn't work, and then move to the next application. So continue to make progress, but start small. Those are my 2 points. Thanks, Kirsten.
Fantastic, thank you. And then Michael, please wrap it up for us.
Yeah, thanks, Kirsten. I'll emphasize the same points that all the other panelists did, but maybe a slight twist, which is, the the fundamental nature of zero trust means that, we need to understand what our identities and what our resources are, the accesses that we need. And then we can make decisions about those accesses and how to manage those resources. So fundamentally, it is just this assessment process against whether the maturity model, against other zero trust principles that you might have, but just simply understanding what those basics are in your enterprise today are going to be critical to getting started in that journey and understanding where to start first, the things that are going to be most critical. I talked about earlier in the conversation about like privileged access, right? So understanding just where your basic privileged accesses are today. A lot of enterprises don't and can't fully enumerate, for example, every super user or root account that they have in their system and who has access to those. So merely just inventorying, those existing accesses and seeing which ones you can just remove. People that have left your organization or people that no longer need that access. That's a really simple step that will help further that journey. And then once you understand that, where those are, then you can start providing decision points around those, how to re-add access or when to add access and under what conditions. And once you've done that, you're starting down that journey. And then the last thing I'll say is, I mentioned this before, but zero trust does assume and start with the security basics. If you can't get those security basics right, get those down first before you try to do something more complicated, like building out a zero trust architecture for your whole enterprise. So Davon noted, start with this single application. See if you can make a single application follow zero trust principles. And then once you can do that, and master doing that, then expand outwards. Along those same lines, we've talked about zero trust control planes as being the framework and system by which you can make those access decisions. And in most cases, in the maturity model that CISA put out, admits this, right? You might have in the beginning manual processes to do that, right? You don't necessarily need to start with a full-blown zero trust control plane that automates every aspect of that process. And you can build towards that as you go and start with those manual processes or manual tools today.
Excellent. Well, thank you so much to our panelists for these incredible insights. I know we all learned a lot today, and I want to thank you all at home for joining us as well. So we hope to see you again for our next one, which is on September 15th from 1:30 to 2:30 p.m. Eastern Time, this time for ATARC's Transforming Agency Security Operations with Artificial Intelligence. And if you join this webinar, you get to hear a focused discussion on how public and private sector practitioners are leveraging the latest AI innovations in order to accelerate security analytics, identify and classify attack vectors, and enable advanced enterprise threat detection. So please go register for that one, and we hope to see you there. Everyone have a great rest of your day, and we will talk soon. Bye.
Goodbye.